Now, according to the Bible, Noah and his wife and his sons' wives got off the ark after the devastating flood which destroyed everything on the face of the earth that had the breath of life. They became the progenitors of the world's current population. But surely if Noah did this, and he didn't kill his family, and they actually repopulated the earth, then, as Yekis Science asked, there should be evidence of this. Historic evidence, genetic evidence in both humans and animals. Do we find any such evidence? Well, first, looking at it historically, there is loads of evidence of a worldwide flood and Noah and his family. Over 250 cultures worldwide have legend, record, or mythology of a worldwide flood. Now, this is staggering in and of itself. Imagine being the first to communicate with an isolated tribe in a jungle deep in the Congos of Africa, and after learning their language, you discover they have a story of a worldwide flood in which a very few of their ancestors were saved on board a floating vessel with a whole pile of animals. How did these people get this story passed on for generations when they've been isolated from the rest of the world? But now virtually every culture in the world is like that. That single fact is powerful evidence for the historic worldwide flood. We have all descended from Noah and his family, so it makes sense that we would all have remnants of that history in our culture. But even more specific is historical documents. Bill Cooper, in his book After the Flood, reveals amazing historical document after historical document. Documents that were rejected only after the advent of evolution and liberal historians. For instance, in the Big Valley Creation Science Museum in Big Valley, Alberta, just a short drive north of Drumheller, you can see one of the very few authorized reproductions of scrolls from the Lambeth Palace in England. Edgar Nuremberg, one of the men who helped build the museum, obtained 2 replications, one of which is now on display at the Big Valley Museum. These scrolls from the 1400s are the genealogical history of England's kings. Now, genealogy was very important and meticulously recorded because that was how you proved you were royalty, by ancestry. These scrolls record the history of King Henry VI right through to Noah's sons Japheth, and then to Noah, and then to his father Lamech, right through to Adam and Eve. Liberal and evolutionary historians rejected such ancestries as fabricated. However, this fails to explain away the lineages for multiple reasons. For instance, other cultures in other parts of the world, speaking and writing completely different languages, also record history to the sons of Noah. Now, there are gaps in the records, but the names appear in multiple languages and multiple cultures, with the same names in the same sequence. Now, this makes complete sense because we are all descended from the same lineage, that of the family of Noah. In fact, Noah and the Ark and the story of the Great Flood can be seen in the Chinese characters, which are made of pictograms. Kuixin Wu et al. Described this in detail in a 2005 Creation Technical Journal paper, showing that Nuwa was undoubtedly the Noah by analyzing multiple flood legends carried by the Chinese peoples. Yes, the flood legend has been distorted over time, but even that distortion is a fascinating subject in itself that actually lends credence to the biblical account of the flood. The Chinese Great Flood, according to their legends, occurred during the legendary period. That's about 2500 BC, which is exactly when creationists would say the Great Flood happened. These Chinese pictogram characters come from oracle bones and bronzeware dating between 1050 years before Christ to as much as 1600 years before Christ. Now, obviously, this was way before any Christian influence, as Christ had not yet even been born. These pictograms reveal numerous details about this great flood, the man Noah, and 7 others, his family, including his wife, his sons, and their wives. The great ship, which had stopped upon a mountain after surviving a flood so great that there was no land visible, only the sun. As Nelson and Chang point out in their books, even the sacrifice made to God after getting off the great ship can be deduced in these pictograms. Other Asian peoples have recorded ancestral history preserved in their traditions that date to generations right to Adam and Eve. The Mayo peoples have poems they recite at weddings and funeral ceremonies for reasons of association. Again, writing with pictograms not even remotely related to other languages like English or Greek, the Mayo poems were around long before missionaries came along. In fact, it was missionaries who were fascinated by these traditions and translated the poems into English because they were understandably fascinated by them. The poems talk about the principles of their ancestry, right back to the first man and woman at creation. On that day, God created the heavens and earth. On that day, he opened the gateway of light. In the earth, he made heaps of earth and of stone. In the sky, he made bodies, the sun and the moon. In the earth, he created the hawk and the kite. In the water, he created the lobster and the fish. In the wilderness made he the tiger and the bear, made verdure to cover the mountains, made forest extend with the ranges, made the light green cane, made the rank bamboo. On the earth he created a man from the dirt. Of the man thus created, a woman he formed. Then the patriarch Dirt made a balance of stones, estimated the weight of the earth to the bottom, calculated the bulk of the heavenly bodies, and pondered the ways of the deity, God. The patriarch Dirt begat patriarch Seta. The patriarch Seta begat a son, Lusu, and Lusu had Galo, and he begat Lama. The patriarch Lama begat the man Noah. His wife was the matriarch Gobaluin. Their sons were Lohan, Loshen, and Japhu. The similarities of these Mayo names to those recounted in the Bible are stunning. It's especially interesting to note the name of Noah's wife, as traditionally it has been held that her name was a version of Gwen, which is the root word for our English word queen. Names become distorted or adapted across languages. For example, my last name is actually Ukrainian, de Ju Bi, with the unique Ukrainian letters which do not exist in English, being transliterated into English letters. And so we see similar things apparently happening with the name of Noah's wife, Gwen, Queen, Gabaluin. Noah's name and his sons' names are more obvious with Noah as Noah, Lohan would be Ham, Loshen would be Shem, and Japhu would be Japheth. Now, I had mentioned cultures around the world that have traditions, legends, and mythology about a great flood in their past. These Mayo poems are another example of the literally hundreds we find around the world. Watch what else they recite as the principles of their ancestors. So the earth began filling with tribes and with families. Creation was shared by the clans and the peoples. These did not God's will nor returned his affection, but fought with each other, defying the Godhead. Their leaders shook fists in the face of the mighty. Then the earth was convulsed to the depth of 3 strata, rending the air to the uttermost heaven. God's anger arose till his being was changed. His wrath flaring up filled his eyes and his face, until he must come and demolish humanity, come and destroy a whole world full of people. So it poured 40 days in sheets and in torrents, then 55 days of misting and drizzle. The waters surmounted the mountains and ranges. The deluge ascending leapt valley and hollow, an earth with no earth upon which to take refuge, a world with no foothold where one might subsist. The people were baffled, impotent, and ruined, despairing, horror-stricken, diminished, and finished. But the patriarch Noah was righteous. The matriarch Gabaluin upright. Built a boat very wide, made a ship very vast. Their household entire got aboard and were floated. The family complete rode the deluge in safety. The animals with them were female and male. The birds went along and were mated in pairs. When the time was fulfilled, God commanded the waters. The day had arrived, the flood waters receded. Then Noah liberated a dove from their refuge, sent a bird to go forth and bring again tidings. The flood had gone down into lake and to ocean. The mud was confined to the pools and the hollows. There was land once again where a man might reside. There was a place in the earth now to rear habitations. Buffalo then were brought, an oblation to God. Fatter cattle became sacrificed to the mighty. The Divine One gave them his blessing. Their God then bestowed his good graces. The poems then talk about the generations after the flood rebelling against God and building a tower, and God judging them by changing their languages. Again, stunning resemblance to the history presented in the scriptures of the Tower of Babel. The Maya poems then recite their generations descending from Japhet. The patriarch Japhet got the center of nations. The son he begat was the patriarch Gomen, who took him a wife called the matriarch Goyong. Their grandson and his wife both took the name Tutan. Their descendants are given in order as follows: Patriarch Gaundan Muan, Matriarch Kaudan Muju, Patriarch Jenku Davu, Matriarch Jinyo Boje, Patriarch Ganjan Nuang, wife not given, Patriarch Siguang, Matriarch Malgach. Their children, 11 in number, was each the head of a family. 5 branches became the Maya nation. 6 families joined with the Chinese. Notice that one of Japheth's sons was named Gomer. And so we once again see the obvious lineage of Japheth and Gomer in the Maya people's ancestral history. Now from Noah, we see in the scriptures a listing of his sons and 16 of his grandsons. Those sons and grandsons are prolific throughout history, as tribes, clans, nations, and landmarks were named after them all. We can trace the lineages of groups like the Slovak peoples to Magog, another one of Noah's grandsons born to Japheth. Another of Japheth's sons is Meshach, which is the ancient name for Moscow. You can even see the name of Meshach today, preserved virtually unchanged by time, in the name of the Meshera lowland, the region around Moscow. Now, I could go on at great length about the historicity of the sons of Noah, but I will stop there and encourage you to read for yourself on this fascinating subject at multiple sources, all freely available on the internet. Before the break, we were talking about the evidence of Noah and his sons from history. So what about genetics? Is it possible for all of the races to arise from just 8 people? Well, yes. In fact, it's possible for all the races to arise from just 2 people. All the skin colors we see around the world are just variations of a pigment called melanin in our skin. Now, people can have a very wide range of expression of this pigment, from very dark to very pale. The physical differences are, again, just variation in genetics, combined with the influence from the environment and diet. For example, heavy brow ridges are prominent among the classical Inuit or the Australian Aborigines. Now, this has to do primarily with diet, as some of the jaw muscles go around those brows, and so a diet involving a lot of heavy chewing or heavy use of the jaws tends to produce heavy brow ridges. So even variations among the cultures are not necessarily because of genetic variation. Now, if there had been a worldwide flood, then there would have been what we call a genetic bottleneck. We have from creation till the flood organisms diversifying. Then all of the humans and animals are wiped out except for a scarce few. So, like our discussion of variation within dogs previously, a Chihuahua has had a whole pile of genetic variation removed. A Chihuahua cannot produce a Great Dane because all of the genes for producing a Great Dane have been removed. So now think of it like that, but on a large scale. a lot of genetic information gets lost at the bottleneck. From there, those scarce few animals then diversify again, isolating the genetic variation among them, so we get things like Great Danes and the world's most useless dog, the Chihuahua. It's the same principle with all of the animal kingdom, including humans. If such a bottleneck has occurred, we should be able to take genetic samples from the large groups of animals and people and see evidence of this genetic bottleneck. Do we find evidence of a recent genetic bottleneck? Oh yes, splendid evidence. However, it comes with one caveat. When researchers measure rates of genetic change, they assume evolutionary timescales of hundreds of thousands to millions of years. So they use those assumed ages to give a timescale to the number of changes that have taken place. So while even evolutionary researchers admit there's been a genetic bottleneck in animals, their time frame has been greatly exaggerated. For example, the human mitochondrial DNA evidence for a genetic bottleneck was obvious, but the date of that bottleneck didn't line up with observations. The researchers who observed actual rates of genetic change based on modern observation would calculate dates to the genetic bottleneck and get dates in stark contrast to previous studies which based their dates on evolutionary assumptions. Dates based on observed rates of change would be as much as 20 times faster than the rates of change needed for evolutionary speculations to work. In other words, the evolutionary researchers used their rates of change, which were built upon evolutionary timescales, a very slow rate of change which pushed mitochondrial Eve back to perhaps 100,000 years ago. However, during studies of the bodies of executed Russian Tsars, it was discovered that these rates of change were far faster than originally thought. Such re-evaluations can change the date of the mitochondrial Eve, as she is called, from 100,000 years ago to 6,000 years ago, perfectly aligned with the biblical time scale. So even the evolutionists have acknowledged the evidence for a past bottleneck is prolific. They just have different dates for when the bottleneck happened. Dates which are built upon the premise of the evolutionary time scale, a time scale which is falsified in many ways and doesn't line up with modern day observations.